in order to meet a deadline. That's also by our friends over at Workfront. And you know what this means, right? This means we literally don't have time to pee when it comes to marketing. Part of the reason this happens is because in marketing, and in content marketing in particular, we focus on doing things rather than doing the things with the most impact. Very rarely do you see marketing teams step back and say, hey, hang on a second. Maybe we shouldn't focus on just churning out more content. Maybe we should take a look at how we can actually have a bigger impact with our content. So this really brings me to why I think content marketing is incredibly important. And I think Rebecca Lee put it best when she said content is the atomic particle of all digital marketing. Without content, there's no paid media. Without content, there's no owned media. And without content, there's no social media. So it really comes down to content for a lot of us, regardless of the industry, regardless of our business model. Content is oftentimes the foundation of our strategy. But for marketers, this means that we've had to create more and more and more content. And not only do we have to create more content, we have to create better content, because it's not just about quantity, it's also about quality. And on top of that, we have to create content for everybody. We have to create content for the whole buyer journey, content for the top of the funnel, content for the middle of the funnel, content for the bottom of the funnel, content for the sales team, content for the customers, content. And unfortunately for us, this means we've ended up in an environment where, if you're familiar with the term, content shock is becoming more and more prevalent across many industries. These stats are from Content Marketing Institute's and Marketing Prof's most recent report on the state of content marketing, and it's over 70% of marketers, both in the B2C and B2B areas, said that they're going to produce more content than they did in 2015. At the same time, almost 80% of these marketers can't measure the success of their content. Huge disconnect there, guys. Huge disconnect. Hey, we're going to make more, but we're not actually really sure if it's having an impact. So how do we actually know whether or not it is? This is another stat that I actually saw, and it broke my heart a little bit, especially since I really love the whole process of content marketing. 90% of content goes unused because it's irrelevant. This is from our friends over at Forrester. And this really brings to light one of the fundamentals problems of content. Now, I have painted a pretty bleak picture, but the reality is the power of great content is still really, really strong, regardless of, you know, the maybe inefficient processes and the ways that we aren't necessarily optimized. If you nail down good content, content has the power to build a brand, grow an audience, generate leads, and of course, at the end of the day, generate customers. But the question we need to ask ourselves today is, how do we actually get more bang for our buck when it comes to content marketing? Well, we need a more strategic approach. We need to approach content in a much more thoughtful way. So we're going to talk about some of the areas I want you to focus on, some of the tactics I want you to focus on in 2017 to not just focus on more content marketing, but focusing on better content marketing, on content marketing that's actually going to make an impact. 4 areas we're going to cover. Number 1, the concept of customer development for content marketing. If you're familiar with that term, you're probably familiar with it from the perspective of building a product or a company, but we don't think of it when it comes to content marketing. We're going to talk about strategic content creation. Don't just become a content factory churning out blog post after blog post. You need to get more strategic about it. And then, of course, distribution, often ignored, not enough time spent on it, way too much time spent on creation. And then we're going to talk about how to optimize that experience when it comes to content marketing. So first thing I want to talk about is relevance. And this really leads into that whole concept of customer dev for content. Remember that stat I showed you a minute ago that said 90% of content goes unused because it's irrelevant? That means the stuff that the vast majority of us are creating doesn't matter. So it's not quantity, it's quality. We've all heard that before. But it's not just quality, it's relevant. Is it the right content at the right time for that person at whatever stage they are in your buyer journey? It's not just quality. It's not just that the thing needs to be good. The thing needs to be relevant. That's really important. So if you focus on relevance for content creation, it's a high upfront investment, but you get a huge long-term payoff. So how do you actually do this? Well, This is what most content marketers do, and most marketers in general. When we're talking about anything related to content or growth or tactics or channels, we get into a room and it has a whiteboard, of course, and we throw up a bunch of ideas on the whiteboard and we kind of sit back and we look at them and we discuss them and we decide, hey, I'm going to actually use idea 1, 3, and 5 because those are the best ideas. That's how most of us do content. Unfortunately, that's not what creates relevant content. How do you know what's relevant? Well, you need to go through this cycle of really pulling that information out of your people, so your customers, but also your internal teams, pulling that information out of the, leveraging different tools that are available out there, and pulling that information out of the data that you've collected around your existing content consumption. So how do you actually do that? So number one, you need to talk to people. And as marketers, we don't do enough of that. I find many of us as marketers hide behind our screens and we'll talk to people on Twitter, but we won't necessarily pick up the phones. It's incredibly important for you to talk to people around what type of content you need to create. So here's where we started Uberflip. And your model is going to be different. We're a B2B SaaS company, but the reality is, you're going to need to adjust it based on your business model or your client's business model. So talk to your internal teams. For us, talking to the sales team, talking to the customer success team really helps us understand our customer better because they are on the front lines. Our customer service team talks to people daily. I want to learn from them. Talking to your customers, incredibly important. Don't just talk to them on Twitter. Have a conversation with them. Every 6 months, pick 5 or 6 customers, get on the phone with them, understand what it is they're struggling with and what it is that they need. And then, of course, excuse me, guys, just getting over cold here, so if you hear some intermittent coughing, I'm going to apologize in advance. And then, of course, talk to your prospects. Maybe they're not customers quite yet, but maybe they're subscribed to your blog, or maybe you've got them in your database and you're in a lead nurture process with them. And then, of course, your followers and your fans. Now, who you talk to depends on the type of content you want to create, and it depends on what your goals are. So I've created this little matrix for you guys and really split it up in a couple different ways. So number one, there's, split it up by content, I guess content type. So is it top of the funnel content, middle of the funnel content, bottom of the funnel content? I know I've got a bunch of really smart marketers here and you guys all know what that means. If you don't, Google it, super easy to figure that out. And then you want to cross-reference that with talking to external personas, so your customers, your followers, your leads, and then talking to internal teams. So if you're creating top of the funnel content, when you talk to people outside of your organizations, your followers, your fans, your leads, your customers, the best way to do this is through what I would call an audience survey. So we've done this a couple times at Uberflip because this is something that is constantly evolving, and really what you want to do is you want to really dig into that particular person. Now I'm going to give you the big bucket list of questions that we used in that audience survey. But you have to promise me 2 things. Number one, you're not just going to send a massive online survey because there's a lot of questions here. We didn't necessarily use them all, but this was our initial bucket of them. So you guys can start to pull out whatever ones are relevant. So number one, no big, massive, long survey. Pull out what's relevant. Number two, you have to talk to at least a few customers. Pick up the phone because you're going to have conversations that are going to give you really interesting, nuanced answers that you're never going to get from an online survey. So here's the big bucket of questions. I'm not going to stay here very long. We'll make the slides available to you. And let's move on. Now, if you're creating top of the funnel content and you want to get insight from your internal teams, from your sales support, customer success team, the question that I love to ask there is, what are the top non-product related questions that you hear, right? And what that's going to do is that's going to give you topics that are adjacent to your product but not necessarily related to your product. So they might not be asking specifically about how does Uberflip do XYZ, for example, but they might talk more generically around, hey, why should we think about content management in this particular way? Right? So that's actually one of the biggest things. And if you find something that's repeated frequently, that's great fodder for content and the type of content that's going to naturally lead somebody to explore more about your company and your product. When you're looking at middle of the funnel content, external people that you're talking to, customers and lead, this is when you want to start asking them, hey, what's your biggest challenge when it comes to the problem solution we're actually solving for you? Not product. You don't want to ask the biggest challenge related to the product. They're not there yet. But at this stage, hopefully they know they have a problem. So if you can talk in more general terms around, hey, what are your biggest challenges around that problem, that's going to make great fodder for content. And of course, sales support, success teams, what are the biggest pain points that you hear from people? That's the information that you want to actually get from your team. Again, not product related, but what are the biggest pain points when it comes to those big challenges and problems that your product is solving. And of course, if you're looking at bottom of the funnel content, that's when, if you're talking to obviously customers, but you also want to talk to people that you lost in terms of leads, to people that didn't actually end up signing up with your product. Maybe they went with a competitor. You want to ask what convinced them, but also what deterred them from signing up for your product, and that's going to lead to really good bottom of the funnel content. And then again, internal teams, the question there is, what are the biggest objections? Why are people not signing up for what it is that we're actually providing, and then maybe why are they signing up? What are the biggest things that are leading them towards that sale? So really understanding what it is that people want at every stage and every cross-section of that matrix is important. Now, the next thing to dig into to determine whether or not your content and your topics are resonating with people and are relevant and are actually in line with what people are searching for and consuming is really to dig into some tools. Now, industry reports can be really helpful depending on the industry that you're in and depending on your customer and whether or not it makes sense for you to either spend money or just do some research for some free content and data that's out there. And then two tools that I really love to leverage for this type of thing as well are BuzzSumo and Answer the Public. BuzzSumo, I think you guys all might be familiar with them. If you're not, I would definitely check them out. It is hands down one of my favorite tools. So what you can do with BuzzSumo, you can do a variety of things with BuzzSumo, but one of my favorite use cases is coming in and really drilling down on a specific topic, and they'll really give you the list of the top content for that topic, how it's resonated with people, where it's been shared, where those people are that are accessing it. And you can really drill down and actually segment that data by the type of content. So, how many of these are articles versus infographics versus videos, et cetera, et cetera. So BuzzSumo is a great tool to start to dig into what it is people actually care about and are searching and are sharing. And then another great tool that I've been really a big fan of in the last few months is answerthepublic.com. And what Answer the Public does is it gives you a much better way to look at the type of information that people are actually looking for. And if you've ever done the thing where you go to Google and you start to type in a keyword and then you see what the autocomplete is, it's kind of riffing on that a little bit, where you can actually start to get almost like a matrix, like a visualization of the different things and the relationships with different keywords that people are looking for, different topics that they're searching, what it is that they want to understand. So the last piece of this, we've got people, we've got tools, the last piece of this is data. And of course, you want to dig in, and there's really two types of data you're going to dig into when it comes to content marketing. It's not that hard. We all know this stuff. Many of us aren't doing it. You're either going to look at your website metrics or you're going to look at your conversion metrics. And when I say conversion, that's highly dependent, obviously, on your goals. So, conversion for you might be a lead off of an ebook or a white paper or webinar, but conversion for you might also be an actual customer. So you need to figure out what the goal of that particular content is and have your data inform what's actually moving the needle for that content. One note that I would say here is you want to make sure you differentiate between engagement metrics and growth metrics. Too many times content marketers focus too much on the pink and not enough on the black side of this screen. So when we talk about engagement metrics, it's things like time on site, pages per visit, social shares, bounce rates, that kind of thing. When we talk growth metrics, this is when I want to know, hey, what's our conversion rate? What's our visitor to lead conversion rate? How many of those leads are turning into customers? What's our cost per lead when it comes to content? That's stuff that's figure-outable for the most part. But if you're using content as a growth driver, if you're using it for lead generation, those are the types of things where you need to set up that infrastructure to understand your growth metrics. I'm not saying engagement metrics aren't important. I think they can be good indicators of certain things depending on your goals, but you need to go deeper beyond that in order to really understand what's actually impacting behavior. So relevance is number one, and it sounds a little bit fluffy, but 90% of the content out there is crappy content because it's not relevant for people. So you have to go through that. Now, the next piece that I want to talk about is really strategic content creation. Again, you don't want to get to the point where you're just churning out more and more and more and more content. We have to change our overall approach. So many of us think, hey, how do I get more traffic, more traffic, more traffic? That shouldn't be the question we're asking ourselves. The question we should be asking ourselves is, how do I hit my goals with the least amount of traffic possible? How do I hit my goals? By creating the least amount of content possible, right? That's what we want to start to think about. So when it comes to creation, more is not more, better is more. And most content, as I said, underperforms. Here's some quick slides. Now, this is actually, talk about strategic content creation. I took these slides directly from another slide deck and really was able to rejig these slides for the purposes of this presentation. That's strategic content creation. I did not create them from scratch. And this actually came from a webinar that we did with the folks at BuzzSumo. I showed you that tool earlier. And some really interesting information here. So when you actually take a look at a segment of the internet, and what we took a look at actually was B2B marketing specifically, and sort of those types of sites, and then also some of the big popular sites. Take a look at the difference in the mean shares. So the top 5, TechCrunch, Inc., Entrepreneur, Moz, and SME, have a mean share of over 1,000 and a median share of about 800. See how much it drops when we take a look at the next 95 popular sites? Huge, huge decline there. Now, to me, that's a sign that most content is underperforming. Let's split that up even more. Here's the top sites. There's a median shares, 800. The 95 next popular sites, median shares is only 100. HubSpot B2B customer sites, and this is all of HubSpot's customers that are B2B. It's based on 127,000 articles. Their customers are getting a median of 22 shares. And just a million random articles that they pull have a median of 8 shares. That is incredibly low. That shows lower engagement in content marketing. Now, here's another interesting way to look at it as well. You've got 100 sites here. Only 4% of those sites get more than 3,000 shares. Only 4%. Which is crazy. And listen, that type of data has been prevalent elsewhere. Buffer has actually published data that shows shares have dramatically decreased. TrackMaven has published data that has shown that engagement with branded content has decreased by up to 17%. There's way more of this stuff. And yes, people are consuming more content, but it's spread out over a huge variety of different types of content. So each individual piece is not getting more engagement. Each individual piece is getting less engagement. And this is what leads us to the content marketing power law. This is something that a lot of people have talked about in the last couple of years, and it's becoming more and more important to understand. A very small portion of content is responsible for the majority of your results. Every single company that I've worked with from a content perspective follows this. When I look at their analytics, if they're doing content and I break down their metrics, a tiny, tiny percentage of their content is responsible for the majority of their results. So how do you capitalize on that? And there's some key characteristics of high-performing content. So number 1, is it relevant? Right back to the relevance side of it. Number 2, is it actually aligned with your goals? Number 3, is it unique to you? The best type of content is the kind of content that only you can provide that's highly relevant to the people that you want to talk to. And at the end of the day, are you looking at the world through the lens of your product? That's what good content does. Doesn't sell your product outright, doesn't pitch product, doesn't get overly salesy. But if your product was a person and they stepped out onto the street and they were looking out at the world, how would they see the world? That's how you have to approach content marketing. And, some really good examples, BuzzSumo and Moz published some great data around some of the articles that they actually had analyzed. They had a 30-page report to discover the content that gets most shares, most links, which formats work the best, and they leveraged this into multiple webinars with different partners. They leveraged this into blog articles. They leverage this into many, many, many things. This is the type of content only they could create because only they have the data. But they took that content and they started to leverage it in many different ways. They waterfalled that content into many different uses in order to squeeze all of the value out of it. That's what you need to start thinking of. Similarly, I quoted this report earlier in the presentation, 2016 Benchmarks, Budgets, and Trends for Content Marketing. Content Marketing Institute of Marketing Profs, they do the same thing. They actually use this data to feed and fuel their content moving forward. We do it at Uberflip too. In this case, it's a little bit different. We had an event that we ran, a real-life event at the end of August. And from that event, we waterfalled that content into many different things. How are we able to squeeze as much out of that as possible? Well, we repurposed it into an online experience, videos, slides, transcripts. That's expected. Everybody knows you're going to do that. But then we took the audio and we repurposed it for our podcast. Awesome. Now we don't have to record separate podcasts. Now our podcast is set for the next couple of months. Amazing. Not only were we able to leverage the content ourselves, but we saw content waterfall effect on guest sites, on contributed content, other people writing about it, other people publishing the content that we're leveraging from the original source, which was the event. More of that type of thing. And really interesting way to leverage content as well. We had the folks from Unbounce actually attend our event, and they threw up a landing page and they said, hey, sign up for this. We're going to take notes throughout this conference and we're going to put them online for you. That's content, right? And that all came from a 2-day event, and it's scattered all over the interweb. So that's the kind of waterfall effect you want when you look at creating those big pieces of content, whether it's a big research report or an ebook or a webinar or something about a really big idea. Take that and then start to split it out. Jay Baer calls this content atomization. Some people call it repurposing. Some people call it waterfall. Whatever you do, make sure that it's high value and that it can be leveraged multiple times. So here are some different channels you can use this to leverage. If you've got really great data, newspapers love that kind of thing. Online publications love that kind of thing if it's really interesting and relevant to people. So you can use that content in any kind of PR strategy that you have. You can use it for guest blogging, webinars. Obviously, you can split up bigger pieces of content and publish segments of it on your blog. Use it in real-life presentations. And then SEO. Don't discount it. There's still a time and a place for SEO and a time and a place for technical SEO. So make sure that that's working together with your content strategy. It's hard to talk about SEO without having a conversation about content as well. Now, distribution. Excuse me, guys. So this is the other area that is often overlooked. Again, we spend so much time creating content and we don't put as much thought into distributing. So you need to think about distribution before the content is published. Where are your people and what do they like? These are some of the distribution strategies and tactics that we use here at Uberflip. Now, nothing mind-blowing here. I mean, these are pretty standard distribution strategies, but it's how you execute within each of those strategies that really matters. So we have a subscriber list that we connect with. We have, we do targeted social, both paid and unpaid. We leverage influencers and we leverage our customers through our advocate hub. We do a lot of co-marketing. We have a focus on SEO, focus on content syndication. We take our content and we put it in a whole bunch of other places that are really targeted, and we know that's where our audience is. And then we work with other publishers as well. And email is not dead. Very targeted and properly segmented email lists can be very, very effective. So I want to talk a little bit about these three things just because these are the three things that I often see people struggle with in terms of execution. So number one, partner marketing. So what I really see people do a lot is, especially smaller companies and startups, is one startup will partner with another startup and they'll do something together, but neither of them has any customers, so it doesn't matter. So you want to be really focused on, number one, who is it you're partnering with? Does the audience actually overlap enough to make it worth it for both of you? Is there an agreed upon distribution strategy? So if you're going to the time and effort to do any kind of partner marketing, make sure in advance you agree that, hey, we're going to promote it on these days through these channels, and we're going to share the lead list, for example, within X amount of time. So really put some thought into your partner marketing and how it works. Targeted email, again, this is something that works really, really well for us, but email is often just not done properly. So number one, if you have a small list, if you're just starting off, you want to keep all of your topics very, very focused. If you have a bigger database, that's when you need to start segmenting your audience. So for example, at Uberflip, we have multiple buyer personas and different people coming into our database because we're solving a few different problems within the realm of content marketing. And the reality is, persona number one doesn't care about the stuff that persona number two cares about. If we sent everything to everyone, our email rates would not be very good, our open rates would not be very good, our click-through rates would not be very good. But as soon as you start to segment that list, you get way better engagement and way better conversion rates across the board. And the third thing I would say when it comes to target emails, ruthlessly cull your list. Delete subscribers that aren't engaged. They don't want to be there, so you shouldn't want them there. And as marketers, we're often really, really, really afraid to do that. Don't be afraid to do that. You need to be really ruthless in terms of who you have in your database and who it is that you're actually communicating with. So I have a couple examples here for you around some of the emails that worked fairly well for us. I'll put these slides, I'll make them available to you so you can actually check them out, but you know, feel free to play around with some of these ideas. And the last area that I want to talk about is really around content syndication. So typically this is something that's paid, and you may or may not have played around with this, but this is, for example, using something like an Outbrain or a Taboola. If you're more on the B2B side, you want something that can get a little more targeted, like you know, something like Integrate or Netline. They can target more of those B2B buyers. But you want to make sure that, you know, as much as using this can be really, really effective, you want to make sure that it's highly, highly targeted. That's going to cost more. If you're doing this for lead gen, it's going to cost more, but that's okay because ideally, you're actually getting higher leads. So if you're doing this for pure distribution, that should be fairly cheap. If you're actually doing this for lead generation, that'll be expensive, but with the lens of highly, highly targeted, qualified people coming through this. So typically the types of things that we syndicate are, you know, ebooks, white papers, potentially webinars, recordings. Those are all gated. And then if you're just looking for distribution, you can do articles and blog posts. We don't do much of that from a syndication standpoint because frankly, you know, that's not something that necessarily is aligned with our goals, but it is something that you can take a look at. So lots of different syndication tools, Outbrain, Taboola, BrightInfo, BrightTalk, you can check out any of those tools. One thing to keep in mind is how this indicator is working. So there's a couple of ways this happens usually. You've got your content, then you've got a third-party publisher. And they actually link back to your site, and the content itself is consumed on your site. So that's one way syndication works. Another way syndication can work is you've got your content, you've got the publisher that you're using, whoever that might be, and then the content is embedded on someone else's site and consumed on someone else's site. These are two very, very different experiences, and it's going to be really different what you do with those leads afterwards, right? So if the content is consumed on your site, hey, maybe they'll start to dig around a little bit more. Maybe they'll sign up for a demo. Maybe you can even send that lead to your sales team, depending on, you know, what type of content it was and, you know, how engaged they were. Maybe based on what their lead score is, if you're doing any kind of lead scoring and that type of a model. But if the content is consumed on someone else's site, they probably don't even really know who you are, right? Because they haven't been kicked over to your house yet. They haven't been invited to your house yet. They're not on your site consuming that content. They're on somebody else's site. So these are the types of leads that require more nurture. These are the types of leads you have to kind of approach with a little bit more caution and make sure that you really warm them up to you before you start to think about sending them, you know, a really aggressive offer or to your sales team. So be sure to consider the experience and make sure you're following up with the right nurture or drip campaign. Now, talking about experience, you know, and here's what we like to call our little dirty secret drip. Great content isn't enough. Really, really relevant content isn't enough. You actually need a really great content experience that's optimized for your goals. So the way I like to think about experience is, you know, if I invite you over for a drink, I love pina coladas, for example. Are you going to want to sit in my dingy, dark basement, or are we going to want to sit in this beautiful sunny beach? Clearly, the beach wins, and that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about content experience, right? You could have the exact same blog post, it could taste exactly the same, just like this pina colada, but the experience is what's actually going to make a difference and drive results, particularly in the context of content marketing for lead generation, for demand generation, to actually drive growth. So when it comes to your content experience, you want to remember three things. Number one, it's got to be readable. Number two, actionable. Number three, tailored. So what do those three things mean? Well, number one, is your content readable? So this is a really great example, and listen guys, this is not rocket science. This is just, you know, what's the user experience? Are people actually able to read your content? Is it mobile optimized? This is Buffer's blog, which is kind of prolific. I just really love the cleanness of it, the readability of it. As I start to scroll down, the paragraphs are shorter, right? And that's actually really important, particularly on mobile, because nobody wants to encounter a big block of text. It's not scannable. It's not easy to read. So you scroll down even more. They've actually made their content much more scannable because you actually have subheads there that you can actually start to split the content up. You can read it. You've got images all the way down. So important to put some thought into that. And in a lot of cases, you know, we know this as marketers, but whether or not we actually execute on it is a whole other thing. Is your content actionable? So For those of you that are familiar with Unbounce, I spoke at their conference a few months back, and my friend Ollie also spoke, obviously, founder of Unbounce, so he gave the opening keynote, and he has a #1 rule for call to action. And his #1 rule for call to action is you need to have a call to action. And I know it sounds kind of stupid, but again, 90% of websites that I go to either don't have it at all or they have a very poorly executed call to action. It's not clear, it's not concise, it's not compelling enough. So when we're talking about calls to action, particularly in the context of content marketing, 3 things: clarity, context, and targeting. Those are the things that you want to remember. So when we talk about clarity, is the action and the value obvious? And, you know, this image, I think, is a good representation. This was at a conference in Las Vegas, obviously. Snapped a picture of this in the elevator right before I got on stage, added it to my slide deck, and it's really, really obvious what that casino wants me to do, what that hotel wants me to do. They want me to go to the casino. The call to action is very, very clear there. And the value is pretty obvious. I'm probably going to go and I'm going to lose all my money. But I'm not wondering what it is that I'm going to get out of it. I'm not wondering what it is that they want me to do. So the next thing that I want you to remember when it comes to calls to action is context. I use this image fairly often, and when I use this image, it's really funny because I always ask, you know, what do you think I Googled in order to get this image? Now, the response varies. Sometimes people say that I Googled, you know, sad man or man crying. On occasion, they've said constipated, which I guess he sort of looks constipated, but it was none of those things. And the reality is that context is everything. He's not sad. This is actually the happiest day of his life. Same thing when it comes to your calls to action. This is an example of what not to do. Here's an article called Advanced Marketing with Smart Filters. Right beside it, we've got an ebook for beginner marketers. That's shitty context. That's not what you want to be doing. However, this makes a lot more sense. This is going to convert better for you because the call to action is contextual with the actual content itself. Here's another great example, HubSpot. What to do if your website traffic is down. You know what? Here's the CTA. Get found on Google by taking advantage of what your competitors already know. That's contextual. People that care about traffic care about all of the content that's within that. It's much more contextual. Another great example by Suomi. Hey, why do we buy? Because of these 5 psychological trigger words in copywriting. Oh, and by the way, we'll give you over 300 of those psychological power words that you can use. That's contextual. And I actually asked Noah how this converted for him, and it was over 7%. And 7% conversion on next to a blog article is actually really high, guys. Next thing I want to talk about is targeting. So when it comes to calls to action, how targeted are they? This is one of my favorite CTAs because it is super, super targeted and it always converts at 100%. That's what you want to keep in mind. So here's a good example. We've got an article around marketing automation resources. We write a lot about that at Uberflip. And this article at first was just sort of in that main feed of our hub. And beside it we had a call to action that was pretty generic. And then we switched it up. We put that article in a section of our content hub that was focused purely on Marketo users. And then we put a really targeted call to action beside it. And this converted way better. And we all know as marketers, the more targeted your CTA, the more conversion you're going to get out of it. Last but not least, guys, is it tailored? So, excuse me, guys. Oh, once again, sorry about that. So is your content tailored? So here's what most people do when they think about how do they organize their content and how do they actually display it in front of people when they get to, you know, the resource center or whatever that experience is. They have their content, maybe they split it up, you know, top of the funnel, middle of the funnel, bottom of the funnel, and then maybe they split it up even further by topic and by type. So if you split your content up by topic, it's probably a good thing, you know, that people could be searching by topic. If you're only splitting your content up by type, and what I mean by that is, you know, putting all webinars together, all white papers together, all case studies together, that can be problematic. And here's why. I have never gone to anybody's resource center and said, give me a white paper. I don't care what it's about, just give me the white papers. I want all the white papers. This tells me nothing, right? We need to get more strategic about how we actually tailor the content experience, tailor the organization of our content, and make it more discoverable. Surface the stuff that people actually care about. So think about splitting up your content by type, okay, but don't only do that. You can cross-reference with that because some people might prefer video over an ebook, but that's not really where you want to do. You want to talk about maybe by topic, but maybe splitting your content up by vertical makes sense for your business. Maybe splitting up by audience segment, even creating different hubs of content for personas or for different accounts if you're doing an account of ABM. So here's a couple great examples. This is a company called Avanti. They do a really great job of creating content and actually organizing it by role. So, they have people coming in from the payroll department, from the HR department, from the IT department. You can bet that people in HR want very different content than people in IT do. And now they can actually find the content that they want, right? In most resource centers, content just gets pushed down lower and lower and lower, and it's just this never-ending feed of stuff that's not organized in a thoughtful way. Here's another really great example, back office associates. They do it by industry, and again, you can bet that the manufacturing sector wants very different content than the retail industry, than the oil and gas industry. This is an example of how we do it at Uberflip. We split it up by audience segments. So we do a lot of work with marketing automation vendors. We integrate with them. Most of our customers use marketing automation tools. So we create a lot of content around marketing automation. And we've actually created audience segments around HubSpot, Marketo, Eloqua, and all the different tools that we integrate with. So, the experience is really a huge part of what's going to drive results, but it's not the only thing. And I think, just to recap this real quickly, I want to make sure that you guys focus on impact, not just on more content creation. So number one, customer depth for content. That's going to give you more relevant content. Dig deep into that. Invest the time and the energy to really understanding the customer. Strategic content creation. Think about that waterfall effect. What really big, impactful, valuable thing can you do that can feed your strategy moving forward? And then distribution. Think about it before you actually even write your first sentence for the piece of content. And then, of course, optimize that experience. Really, really important. Thanks so much, guys. Manish, I will kick it back to you. I think we've got some time for some questions if we have any.
No, terrific, Hannah. That was great material, and those epic examples always make me laugh. Terrific. Funny enough, we also had Ollie as one of our keynote presenters at the WSI convention that recently took place in Toronto, and one of the first slides that he put out there was exactly that same CTA slide that you put on, which was really, really funny.
That's awesome. Right. Ollie is a good friend, and I will quote him in all my presentations.
There you go. All right, so we got a lot of questions coming in, Hannah, so I'm going to start right away. So the first question is related to the top content marketing tools that you recommend. I know that you mentioned BuzzSumo, but in your day-to-day experiences, are there any other tools that you think are really relevant for digital marketers?
Yeah, I mean, I know I already mentioned BuzzSumo, but BuzzSumo is, I think, such a hugely beneficial tool, and they have a lot of different features and products, and they don't pay me to say this, but I say it almost every presentation. So definitely BuzzSumo, and I think at the end of the day, it depends on what it is that you want to try and do, right? If you're talking about experience optimization and actually being able to build out a really comprehensive content experience. If you're a small business, there's a lot of cool things you can do with sort of a basic CMS and something like SumoMe. Which will actually let you do things like add pop-ups and build lists and actually start to understand the metrics around your content. And then on the flip side, if you're a bigger enterprise and you really need to scale content across the org, that's when something like Uberflip might make more sense. And when it comes to, there's a lot of really cool tools for you writers out there, for the people that are actually creating the content, that will just make your writing better. So, if you haven't yet heard of Hemingway app, it's one of my favorites. I don't typically publish anything without putting it through Hemingway. If you just Google Hemingway app, you'll be able to see it. And there's a bunch of tools like that will just really make your writing a little bit more complete. If you head over to hub.uberflip.com, we've written about all of them, so you can definitely find some more interesting tools there.
All right, terrific. Thanks, Anna. Related to this question, any recommendations for doing sort of like a competitive analysis? So let's say if we know that there's 3 or 4 big competitors in our space and we want to look at their content marketing strategy. I mean, of course, you can look at the website and do a whole manual sort of like research, right? Seeing what sort of content's getting a lot of traction. Besides that, is there, again, any sort of a process or a tool that you recommend for doing a competitive analysis?
Yeah, so not to turn this into a commercial for BuzzSumo, but So you can actually do that in BuzzSumo. So part of the search functionality in BuzzSumo is you can actually search a domain. So you can actually check the domain of your competitor and look at what their top performing posts are and see where they've been shared, how they've been shared, by how many people they've been shared, which is actually really valuable because you can start to get a sense for like which of their content is resonating, and you can do this with a cross-section of different competitors. So I think that that's really valuable to understand. And then what I would also do is a search for the actual competitor name when it comes to content, because then you can actually start to see how many times they're being mentioned in other articles. So how much contributed content are they getting? How many guest blog post mentions are they getting? And that's something you can even set an alert for in something like BuzzSumo. I'm sure there are other tools that do that. This is just my favorite. But
and it's also not expensive, right? It's a fairly affordable tool. I think the subscription's like 10 or 12 bucks a month, if I'm not mistaken, for the lowest category, right?
Hugely worth it. Yeah, hugely worth it.
All right, great. Another question that comes along quite often is the frequency of blogging for small businesses, Hana. Everybody's sort of like getting mixed signals in the industry in terms of how much of blogging is good. Now, I know that you addressed a bit of this in your presentation today, when you talked about focusing on relevancy as opposed to frequency, but is there some sort of like a cadence of blogging, especially when you're dealing with a small business? Let's say you're talking to a website that relates to like a lawyer that's focusing on a specific territory, or a plumber. So should they be blogging like once a week, twice a week? Any sort of recommendations, again, based on your experience there?
Yeah, it's always hard to give a hard and fast number. I mean, I would say anywhere from like 1 to 3 times a week will get you sort of a good foundation to start to build. And in that type of context, I mean, listen, like, this content is a long-term play, and I would value consistency over frequency. But the reality is, if you haven't been doing it, you do need frequency. Like, as much as I talk about not focusing too much on creation, that's applicable to people that are already doing a certain volume of content, right? And already sort of have figured out the basics. But if you're just starting and you're sort of in that small business, anywhere from 1 to 3 times a week, and if you can do that consistently, I think that that'll give you a good foundation moving forward.
Perfect. That's great. Visual or text, Hana? What do you think is better in your experience? I mean, a combination is obviously always preferred. You'd given an example there of one of the blogs that was utilizing text very effectively because they were spacing it out nicely in different paragraphs.
Yeah.
But would you, if you had a choice on putting out an infographic for a particular topic or doing an in-depth post on that topic, what would you prefer?
So number 1 would depend on my goals. Number 2, I would do both if I could. If you force me to pick one, if it was a topic that was integral to the problem I was solving and I felt like I could get some SEO play out of it, I would do the in-depth post. I think there's still a room for and value in long-form content, and SEO is not dead, right? So if you had a gun to my head and I felt like it was a high-value topic for me or my company, I would probably do the long-form content. But that said, I would want to take that and I would want to waterfall it, right? If I was just going for the quick shares, maybe the infographic, right? Maybe if I was going for exposure, maybe if it was really for an exposure and an awareness thing and I felt like I could get that infographic embedded in a gazillion different spots, maybe the infographic would take precedence. So it really, really depends on what your goal is, I think.
Oh, that's a good answer. Makes sense. The next question is related to the ideal length of content, Hana. So in your opinion, again, you've talked about relevancy and you've talked about in-depth content, and I know Neil's written a lot on what the length of content that actually performs really well in Google, especially for the ones that are ranking in the top 10 search results. He mentions that your ideal length should be about 2,300 plus in terms of words that you're looking at. Again, based on your experience, should the strategy, the content marketing strategy, be revolved around in-depth content pieces that are like 2,500 words or more, or shorter form content that's really specifically addressing a particular pain point and just going straight to the point?
Yeah, I'm going to keep saying this, but it depends. Listen, like I said, long form content from a search results standpoint, from an SEO standpoint, can still be really, really powerful. At the end of the day, though, not all of it necessarily needs to be super long form. And you know, I I've always struggled with this. How long should it be?
Right.
Question, because from my perspective, it should be as long as it needs to be to articulate the value in the message without being overly verbose, which I think was an
Okay.
overly verbose answer, but
All right.
I think that's really what it comes down to, right? Is like, if SEO is really the play, and if it's like a really valuable topic, then yeah, you want to go more in depth, and maybe going a little bit longer is gonna add some value from a search results standpoint. But at the end
Mhm.
of the day, like, how long does it need to be in order to get the point across in a really effective way?
Okay, great. Another question related to promotion of content. So I know you mentioned a bunch of different ways that you can promote content, Hannah. Can you talk about some of the low budget methods? I know that content syndication and some of these other tactics can be fairly expensive and they need minimums as far as these publishers are concerned. So when you're
Yeah.
looking at localized businesses with low budgets, what would you suggest in terms of really pushing out their content? Would you say that paid social media is a good way to go about it because
Yeah, I was just
you
going
can
to say,
control budgets?
totally. I was going to say play around with some paid social, and depending on what your business is and what your model is, that could be Twitter, it could be Facebook, it could be, even Instagram actually might be interesting depending on the type of business. And that's generally fairly inexpensive, and the benefit to that is that you can get really, really, really targeted, particularly on something like Facebook. You can get geographically targeted, you can get, like, from an audience perspective, you can get really targeted in terms of like demographic and even like what pages do they like, and all of those other factors that could be indicators that they would be good customers for you. So yeah, I definitely think social would be an interesting way to do that. And I would also not immediately discount some of this indication. It's just hard on some of those to control some of the targeting. So for
Right.
example, something like Outbrain, you can probably do for like not that expensive per click,
Mhm,
and
mhm.
spend a few $100s on it. But you just, like, I don't know that I would do that, because you can't necessarily get that targeted, or if you do want to get that targeted, it gets more expensive.
Correct.
So for example, like, do you really want to be published at the bottom of CNN.com? Is anybody
Exactly.
gonna care? Right?
Right. Right. Okay. You mentioned podcasts, Hannah, and that's another question that comes up a lot. In your experience, again, how effective are podcasts? Because I know that their podcasts are, again, a great way of taking content and just
Yeah.
essentially repurposing it and putting that in
Right.
podcasts. So in your experience, how effective are podcasts? And if you had to rate the addition of podcasts as a tactic in someone's marketing strategy, where would you put it?
um it depends. Uh, Podcasts, I think, is a really interesting medium. It's one of my favorites, actually. I actually much prefer audio over video, and I'm a bit of a podcast junkie myself. And I think it can be incredibly effective in certain instances for certain models, depending on who your audience is. I think whether or not you prioritize that over online content is a really big, it's a massive, it depends, right? So like, is your audience or your customer somebody that actually listens to podcasts frequently, or are they not? Or, is this something that you should maybe put off? So I can tell you from our experience, we started experimenting with a podcast at Uberflip. It's called Flip the Switch,
Uh-huh.
which you can download on iTunes, or wherever you get your podcasts. But for us, the reason we did it was largely because we wanted to experiment with a new content format. And because we're all about content marketing, we're a content marketing software, and we also wanted a different way to connect with our audience. We didn't have any real expectations from an ROI perspective. We didn't really necessarily go into it saying, hey, this is going to get us X amount of customers or X amount of revenue. There definitely is something to be said for that, the sort of brand side of things, but you know, when you start to do that really kind of depends on what stage you're at for your business. But what I will say is, you know, as much as it's really difficult to measure the efficacy of a podcast when it comes to things like ROI and customers and revenue, you know, anecdotally, you know, we get great feedback on it. The numbers have been just climbing and climbing when it comes to downloads. But the interesting thing is we just had, and for those of you that are familiar with Uberflip, our model is it's B2B SaaS, right? So we typically sell to larger companies. And earlier this week we had somebody in the office sitting with our sales team, a potential customer. And the really interesting thing is they called me into that meeting, and you know, I think it was like the head of marketing, you know, at a big firm, and he said, I've been listening to your podcast, and that's how I found Uberflip. So,
Oh, wow.
and this is going to be a potentially big deal, right?
Right.
There's no way, though, that I would have been able to measure that ROI, right, like on paper.
True.
So I wouldn't discount it, but I would put some thought into whether or not it makes sense for you and your model and your audience.
All right, great. I think that's all the questions that we have, Hannah. This has been a terrific session. Thank you so much for presenting this to the WSI community, and for all the ICs that signed on today. Thank you so much for attending. We will make a copy of this presentation available to everyone, as well as the slides, once Hannah sends that over to me. Once again, Hannah, thank you so much for today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right, take care. Bye, everyone. Have a great weekend.